Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. And this month, Yatogami has requested some discussion about what I'm going to call data synthesis. Yatogami wants me to discuss this image, I'll bring it back in a minute, and the definitions provided therein. This is largely a free-form interpretation parlay. On the surface, it's a follow-up to your previous parlay about what constitutes knowledge. However, you'd like me to leave any preconceived notions and meanings for my first reading through. In essence, this image is your dictionary, and you want to hear what I think the image is trying to convey about, for example, knowledge, and not what we discussed before. Also, a side note that it's hard, but I'll try, of course, to leave aside any preconceived notions about what I think about these terms or ways of depicting information prior. That's hard to do. But as I have often insisted in Parley, I feel strongly that it's not very helpful to insist on a strict definition of most words for most use cases. Humans just don't use language that way. We use it in a way to convey a sort of word cloud of what we mean. Insisting that that just isn't what the word knowledge means isn't what definitions mean, I would argue. And so I'm not going to worry too much, and for this parlay, you will have to not worry too much about exactly what each of these words mean. I'm really talking to the audience. I'm sure Yatogami has that in mind, and that's why you're asking me this parlay question. So yeah, anyway, we're not going to try to focus too much on that. If I have a really big bias for some term, I'll try to point it out. Yatogami says my own interpretations follow below, and they're spoilered out. The idea is that we're going to read them after I do my own concluding. All right, let's look at that image. So we have 6 images that are all based on the first one is kind of an establishing point, or really the first 3 maybe. These are kind of a word bank you might consider, or establishing terms, and then we're going to conclude some stuff with the bottom 3. You might think of it that way. Data, so raw datum. I'm tempted to say information, but that's, in this context, we're defining that as that other thing. Datum here is just going to be raw input, things you could gather and make into a set of data. I'm trying really hard not to say information, but that's fine. I do think it's useful to differentiate the two. Information, then, jumping there, would be, I think, passing some judgment on those things, treating them as being of different worthinesses, maybe, or of different quality. So, for example, if I were to describe, I'll try to do examples. It might be hard for some of these, but I'll try. If I were to describe what I see outside, like a lot of writers, I wouldn't attempt to describe everything I see outside. I would try to pick the pieces of data that form useful information rather than just giving you the most data. That would not be the most useful, I would argue. Each of these, I also want to highlight that as we jump from each one to the next, from left to right, top to bottom, you are kind of losing something in exchange for some perceived utility to humans. So from data to information, you lose raw data. There is less stuff. The file size gets smaller, you might say, but the meaning gets much larger, to the point that I would argue data is usually not useful to humans in its unmodified form. Generally, you need to at least get to the information stage in this definition for a set of data to gain meaning, to be useful. Although maybe this is outside the scope of this parlay, but you might be able to do some of these without doing the others. That'd be something to think about. But anyway, data to information, basically passing a judgment on that data to choose pieces of it that feel more meaningful, or not treating all possible input as being equal. Another way to think of this might be that certain combinations of words have more meaning than totally random combinations of words. Not necessarily what that meaning is. You might think of that as knowledge. We're jumping to connecting those pieces of usefulness, evaluated data, information, in ways that mean something, that are more than the sum of their parts, I might say. So this would be maybe using the information that I select from the data that I see outside to give you enough information that you can connect the dots and conclude that I am living in a managed property, like an apartment complex or something similar. I could tell you enough information that you would form a sort of like knowledge set or knowledge unit. They would go click, like Legos piecing together or something, and you would get a piece of information, maybe you would say, that is the sum of the parts, I guess you might say, of the information that it came from. Knowledge then would be referring to that piece of, you might say, data or information that you gain from connecting together meaningful pieces of data, which you might call information. Cool. Okay. So if data is me just describing everything I see, and information is picking pieces of information, that piece of data, I'm going to fail at that more times in this parlay, that feel more meaningful or more useful, knowledge would be piecing that together to the point that you understand where I am, basically, or, what kind of environment this is. Then we go down to insight. I wanted to say quickly that for between information and knowledge, connecting things this way, I do think at this stage you already have a little bit of reading between the lines, right? And so it's possible that being given a certain set of information, it kind of appears as if the person who gave this set of information is trying to suggest that you could put it together like this. And for different people, there might be more or less obvious ways to construct that information into a piece of knowledge, which may result in different pieces of knowledge without guidance or some expectations. So that's worth mentioning. I feel like there's already a lot of misunderstanding at these basic levels. I personally think that a lot of misunderstanding is at a lower level of understanding, not because discussion gets so complicated. I think once people have kind of done the same approaching movements to get to a certain discussion point, that seemingly more complicated stage of discussion is often quite coherent because people have the same bedrock or foundation for it. Whereas it's actually often in these fundamental stages where misunderstanding occurs. People getting a little confused because a discussion is complicated, if they have the same framework, is a comparatively simple problem to solve, in my opinion. I just think it's noteworthy that these first three, they might seem simple, but they are, in my opinion, the most complicated part where maybe the most is removed, you might say. There is a lot of human bias already in there. I just think that's interesting, and it's important because we're going to keep talking about this topic. Insight, then. Knowledge, insight. Maybe this would be the way it's represented in the image. I would say this seems like taking certain points of information constructed into a piece of knowledge and considering them to be noteworthy. Now, maybe I'm focusing too progressively, like insight is then an evolution of knowledge. Maybe a different way to think about it that doesn't focus on that bias would be to say that insight is extracting a specific piece of information from a piece of knowledge, kind of going backward from knowledge to information, maybe, getting a piece of knowledge and taking the meaningful bit or something noteworthy from the set. For example, it might be hearing my description of the environment I live in and taking a piece that seems out of place or noteworthy in some way, or learning something about where I live by extracting something that is different or just odd about the description to you. From your perspective, you might say, well, that's weird, or I haven't really seen that before. For example, I guess here where I live, these townhouses have these kind of walled or fenced in patios, you might say, like little outdoor spaces. They're of a size where it's not as if they're comically small, but neither are they big enough that there's really any feeling of privacy, And so me personally, they could be much smaller and I wouldn't really care either way. They would have to be bigger, not huge, but bigger, to provide like real enjoyability or comfort. It doesn't really feel like my house, you know what I mean? It's on that ratio, that threshold where it's just the wrong amount of space to feel like it's actually my space. It feels a little bit like it's just outside, which I guess is fine, but I'm a relatively private person most of the time, and so I don't really go out there. It's useful sometimes. I cut my hair out there, but anyway. Yeah, so maybe I would say that that's a bit of insight. Certainly when I was looking at places to move to, that is one of the more outwardly unique qualities of this location, and I think it speaks to a place that is trying to feel a little more upscale, but like isn't actually, because it isn't actually now that I live here. Anyway, insight to wisdom. This one is the hard one for me. Now, when I looked at this image, I thought this parlay is going to be easy, which it hasn't been. It's hard to define these things, even if you feel like, oh yeah, I know what that thing is. You know, I do that. You might think to yourself, but I don't know. It is challenging. I'll admit this is also the place where my biases from outside come in a little. I'm used to wisdom as being intelligence versus wisdom in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition or just role-playing games. Intelligence being, I would say, like data, or the top three, like data, information, knowledge, and wisdom being, the way it's often explained is things like learned experience, or things maybe you could say like things you decide for yourself, which I think is basically insight and wisdom, sure. Another way to think of it, a good spell uses an example. And I do think these role-playing ideas of mental stats are very useful, but we will need to get rid of them a little bit here. I just want to give this example because I think it's useful to think about, like getting a comfortable meaning with them, because I don't have one. There's a spell called Feeble Mind in Dungeons and Dragons, and it's a mental disabling spell. So rather than being physical crowd control where you bind someone, this is kind of a mental crowd control spell where you reduce their intelligence and charisma all the way down, but they still have their wisdom. So the spell explains that this means that they can't speak because they don't have high enough intelligence to construct language. Intelligence in the Dungeons and Dragons, way of wording it. And it's not like they can properly express in some other way. Their charisma is really low. Charisma in Dungeons and Dragons being, I would say, how you express yourself. But their wisdom remaining high means they still know who their friends are. They're not confused who their allies are or people they like. As your DM, I would rule that there is some simplification that goes on here. If you have very complicated feelings about someone, losing your intelligence and charisma may uncomplicate those feelings in ways that would be hard to predict, but you likely wouldn't suddenly have very strong feelings about someone you had complicated feelings about. At least I don't think so, except in a very specific situation. So I guess I think of wisdom as being what you decide, almost, you might say it that way. That's a hopefully less Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition way of thinking of it, which is kind of what you see here. So these points of insight are now connected, as if almost like I said before, that maybe insight is taking the piece of knowledge and picking out bits of information that feel noteworthy, kind of further judging information for its usefulness or unusualness, or there being some further information to gain from those bits of information, perhaps because they are in that bit of knowledge. And then wisdom is then maybe making something like knowledge, information to knowledge, out of those insight points. Insight to wisdom, you then make kind of further knowledge out of the fact that certain bits of information exist in certain bits of knowledge. Another way to think about this, I think, might be universalizing something. For example, if you knew enough about apartments in the area, you might be able to guess the cost or like the price bracket of the apartments that I live in, because you would have come to know that about other places, and you could compare various qualities, see the noteworthy bits of information, and then conclude how much the place I live in or whatever costs, by having created basically a system or a mechanism by which you could determine that. You would have created a piece of knowledge that is select bits of information among other pieces of knowledge that, when connected, where there may or may not have been a connection before, create a useful mental tool. That's how I think of it. I have a very clear idea in my head of what wisdom feels like, this definition of wisdom, not the D&D one. I still kind of don't know what to do with that sometimes. But it's hard to describe. I think that's the best I can do. Something I would like to say before we move on is that I personally put a lot of weight on that, if we can define wisdom that way. That thing where you kind of make a mental machine, I would describe it as, out of noticing noteworthy bits of information in other bits of knowledge and then connecting them to create your own piece of knowledge, your own understanding of a thing, that is interpretive, I've always wondered just how useful these might be to other people. But I consider it to be a very valuable thing to have. I personally think you could call it something like learning how to learn to some extent, or why I personally, as a person quite focused on this type of thinking, I perceive most people as being unproductively mired in specifics. In other words, they focus on they think that information and knowledge are more valuable than insight and wisdom to a degree that seems wrong to me. It seems pretty plain that if you change that balance a bit, information and knowledge are valuable, but insight and wisdom need to be upgraded in perceived value. That our own understanding is significantly more effective most of the time. People just don't treat it like it is, even though it just plainly is. That's how I often feel. This is one of my biggest frustrations with all of humankind, so forgive me that diversion. Let's read Yatogami's interpretations of the six. I may or may not put the thing, we'll see. Okay, data. A collection of facts or observations. They have no intrinsic meaning. They're simply the result of perception. Sure, pretty much the same thing that I described before. And perception could mean lots of things here. Your five senses. I'm not sure what thinking something might be categorized as. Maybe that is somehow a sense, but anyway, you thinking something, I would say, is in there. Facts or observation, sure. I think facts sometimes has the weight of human constructed truth. And here, I believe Yatogami and I mean, facts as in just things that, like, uninterpreted apparent truths, like truths of sensory perception, like that thing is black. And what I mean by that is it appears not to absorb light, or it appears not to reflect light. Like, I'm not trying to say, I think that shade of color is black. I'm trying to say, like, to my eyes, there's no light. Like, it's black. Which is still kind of interpretive, but that's way too big a topic for this parlay. So yeah, data, a collection of facts or observations. They have no intrinsic meaning. They're simply the result of perception. Information, then, you might call facts that have been colored or filtered through by reason. Okay, interesting. A little different than what I said. This is what I said was basically that it's when you evaluate data to be, more or less, I guess, like valid or useful in some way. You're describing it a little bit more like, which makes a lot of sense to me, the idea that you're creating your human understanding of the thing. So, when you see a sign in the United States that's an octagon that is red, those are bits of datum about the sign, but you construct the meaning that those are things that make it a stop sign. I might argue that's like knowledge, or is that just that knowledge is the connection, which means a stop sign means to stop? That's a little bit tricky. The filtering it through reason thing is a little bit of a sticking point for me. I kind of get that. Maybe that's the same thing I mean in a way. But in any case, you give the bits of data some further meaning, I guess, by evaluating them as being, a certain type of thing, a contextual fact, maybe you would say. Let me read what you said about knowledge before I try to understand that further. You said knowledge is connections that have been drawn between particles of information. The sum of these connections constitutes knowledge. In other words, knowledge is composed of facts that have been colored and connected by reason. Sure. And the sum of the connections is what is knowledge. I said before something similar where it's like thinking of it as it's the combination of information rather than it being some further thing you learn from the combination of that information. But that's tricky, right? Like if you say all the qualities of a stop sign and then you conclude that it's a stop sign that means blankety blank. That's tricky, right? Is constructing all those points, is summing them into this is a stop sign. Is that additional information, or is that just the sum and no more of those parts? That's finicky in my mind. Yeah, let me read the rest of yours. And I think it is useful to take these as a whole. It's unfair to try to to try to evaluate them individually. Insight, you said, is two distantly connected particles of information, in essence, knowledge, that share a hitherto uncovered link. So the idea is that these are, I said I was going to read them all before I evaluate them, so I'm going to read wisdom immediately after. A direct connection is plotted between the particles of insight. Okay, so the way you're describing them is a lot more like steps of a process rather than them being individual forms of knowing, I guess, which is sort of what I was doing, or different ways of understanding. I kind of feel like at each stage you can have an understanding experience. They're not necessarily steps of a procedure. But I totally get that they would be steps of a procedure. Sure. So let's read the insight and wisdom ones again. Two distantly connected particles of information share a hitherto uncovered link. In other words, there is something meaningful about that bit of information. In the context of there being also that bit of information, they are connected in some way that isn't as simple as just the piece of knowledge they're contained in. So the example I gave before was details about a property containing some learnable facts or information about that property, but you need to connect them in a way that goes beyond just their knowledge-based connection, which I guess is what you're saying, I think, is what you're saying too. Not that we have to have the same meaning, but I feel like we do. I'm just trying to be rigorous and not assume we do where we don't. A direct connection plotted between the particles of insight is that wisdom that you then know what people's properties cost. I don't know. That example's weird. It's what's outside my window. Give me a break. Okay, and then so finally we get to conspiracy theory, which I didn't really do. I kind of purposely left this off at the end. Conspiracy theory, in my mind, is when these connections go a bit wild and create meaning that skips steps, is how I would describe it. I feel like there's a lot of ways to define conspiracy theories, and I'm going to give a bunch of little ones. One way to think of it is that it's somebody feeling like they've done the whole process when they only did one part of the process. So in other words, they did a thing that feels like, I think it's often insight and wisdom. They see disparate bits of information that they feel are connected in a way that goes beyond the knowledge connecting them, while losing focus on the knowledge connecting them, losing focus on the maybe context, you would say, creating what seems to be meaning. I mean, they did it using the process by which they know other things. They come to feel like if they don't know that, they don't know anything because they got all the information the same way, but they didn't. There's a moment at which they skipped steps or demanded less of those points. Subconsciously, they want the conspiracy theory to be true, and so it would be convenient for them if the world was this simpler way rather than a unpleasant, unsatisfying, complex mess, which is what it actually is. Nearly all conspiracy theories are a way to neatly tie with a bow something that can't be neatly tied with a bow, in my opinion. They appear to be cynicism, but I think they're generally self-comfort. They make the world seem like something you can get specifically frustrated with or whatever, in a way that it isn't. It isn't, but it would feel good if it was. It just isn't. And so, again, I think what happens is that people skip steps of the construction of understanding because in some very quiet moment that they might not even notice, they want the conspiracy theory to be true. So they give it a little bit of slack. They just gently ignore in some subconscious moment a little point, probably information and knowledge, as they're constructing insight and wisdom that allows the conspiracy theory to have legs, basically. The way to understand this is that when you hear someone describe a conspiracy theory, you, a reasonable person, will often be immediately able to think of many, many other data points that make it preposterous that conspiracy theory would be true. And the person who believes in the conspiracy theory, well, they have some, what they see as evidence why it's true. They just disregard the evidence that makes it untrue. It's not like they have... There's not no reason to think that conspiracy theory is the case. It's just that taking the information as a whole, you would conclude that it isn't the case, but they don't take the information as a whole. They've chosen to kind of skip that step. They take the insight and wisdom and not the knowledge. They take that connection, but not the stuff around it. That's how I would define it using this image. Conspiracy theory, Yatogami says, is reason is used only as far as converting data into information. Further connections between particles of information are incidental. The goal seems to contain particles of information rather than to connect them. Oh, I see. A down-to-earth person might draw comparisons between this and constellations, a perceived pattern or outline in a group of stars. Interesting. So Yatogami is suggesting that it's much more that they just don't make connections. And indeed, in the image, it doesn't evade my notice that the conspiracy theory one removes the knowledge links. It no longer has those. I was wondering if that was just to make the Pegasus look better, basically, instead of having all the lines in there. But indeed, in this image's own language, the knowledge links are not present. So I get why you would think of it that way. Personally, I think of it more like they take the links that seem to be wisdom. And again, I think a big aspect of conspiracy theorists is that they are having the experience of constructing meaning a way that is really how you construct meaning. They just skipped some steps. Like they allowed themselves to loosen up on, I guess, the knowledge step is really where it is. So I definitely agree that there isn't really the connections. And I also think it's something that your explanation is better at, Yatogami, is this idea that a conspiracy theory often feels like it contains pieces of information, but connecting them seems arbitrary. That is another quality of conspiracy theories. I'm trying to describe how I think the conspiracy theorist thinks they are connected. I think they are connected, and they are experiencing the insight and wisdom thing. But from our perspective, right, the connections seem arbitrary, or it's like, why would you connect things that way? You could, but only in so much as you'd connect all these other things that way. And if you did that, you wouldn't focus on the connection between those things. Almost like how, when you take data and make information, you're coloring that a certain way. And if you evaluate most information in this way, you're able to see that this is useful and this isn't. Well, then taking everything as a whole, you wouldn't care about any perceived connection between these data points because it's just clearly not valid in the context of the rest of them. But the conspiracy theorist isn't connecting all those other things. They're only focusing on the perceived insight or wisdom connection. They remove the knowledge at the step of wisdom, I guess I would say. That's how I think of it. And so the wisdom here doesn't encapsulate that, but I do think the connections in the drawing on the conspiracy theory thing, thinking of that as the wisdom yellow line, is how I perceive it. I think there is something that they feel is knowledge. It just isn't in practice, or it's only such a specific level of knowledge that kind of defies the logic by which you'd make other knowledge. That's hard to explain. Yatogami has a conclusion that I want to click on. Current computers are largely trapped straddling the line somewhere between data information and information knowledge. They can be fed facts, but can only process those facts with the rules humans have given them. It does seem like the road to knowledge requires a further faculty, here termed reason. It should be noted, though, that I assumed for simplicity's sake that the data information and information knowledge gaps were bridged by the same faculty. It's possible that these gaps are instead bridged by two distinct faculties. I leave the discussion of that possibility to you. There's one more spoiler out part I'll read first. In either case, I consider conspiracy theories to be a perversion of reason that create the appearance of knowledge without respect to information. The nuances of what constitute insight and wisdom can't quite be captured by this image alone, and certainly the data information and information knowledge gaps are wider than the image suggests. I have something to say that might not immediately seem like a response to that. I do think there's a difference that maybe I haven't been making so clear that I think there is between conspiracy theory and people might conclude things based on sets of information that might not seem like knowledge to the other party. But I think there is a distinct quality that differentiates that from conspiracy theory, because there is a system that humans understand generally by which we use information to construct knowledge. Conspiracy theory, I believe, is drawing those links, as I said, with the wisdom step, while kind of ignoring the other knowledge. But it's not just that, because if it was just that, this would just be like somebody with a poor memory who had very valid, useful pieces of information that lacked context. The difficulty here is that the conspiracy theorist is drawing the wisdom links in a way that doesn't make sense if you have the context of the knowledge around it, I guess I would say. Whereas a lot of the time, you can look at the same set of knowledge and draw different bits of wisdom from that knowledge, that if you explain using the other knowledge as perspective why you drew that conclusion, like, it should make sense to an open-minded person who drew a different conclusion, but they would see, oh yeah, okay, like, given this other information, I suppose the number of data points that would lead you to draw this piece of wisdom is similar to the number of data points that led me to draw my piece of wisdom. But in a conspiracy theory, that isn't the case. The conspiracy theory arbitrarily removes or unweights pieces of information and knowledge, rather than unweighting them or removing them based on a narrative that is supported by the data or the knowledge. Another way to put it is that if every human being in the world went back and used the same process by which a reasonable person constructs wisdom, they would be able to arrive at it. In other words, given the sort of formula or the recipe for that wisdom, you would be able to sort of reverse engineer it. Whereas with conspiracy theory, some of the steps wouldn't make sense to most people. You would need additional information to know why they did those things. If you gave people those additional bits of, it would be experiences, I believe they would still arrive at the same reasoning, if you want to call it that, the conspiracy theory. In other words, if you gave people, I said before, it's kind of like they have a need for the conspiracy theory to be true. If you pressured people enough and made them feel stressed or powerless enough, such that they wanted the conspiracy theory to be true enough, that is the kind of missing step in the equation to construct the conspiracy theory out of otherwise terrestrial, down-to-earth human thinking processes. It's not as if you can't write down the formula for constructing that. It's just that you can't use that formula to really believe a conspiracy theory unless you have had an experience that should be considered irrelevant data when reasoning. Whereas I think people who draw different conclusions that seem like that wisdom process generally do so using a recipe that is replicable. And I believe that the mark of a good discussion, as we've had on stream or on Parley and stuff many times, is that if you can produce the recipe by which you arrived at a piece of reasoning, then there's really no need to worry about whether it is, biased or not. People either will or won't be able to reconstruct that piece of reasoning. And so the proof is in the pudding. If I think a thing, for example, and I think my thing is really reasonable, the person listening to me either will try to be fair and reconstruct my reasoning, or they won't. If they won't, it doesn't matter anyway. And if they will, well, if my recipe does construct that understanding, then perhaps it's useful. And if it doesn't, then it isn't. There's no need to worry about, maybe that's too biased or something. Given enough information, if you kind of write down, show your work, if you will, and be a little scientific about it, to say it that way, I feel like you can usually, reverse engineer the reasoning that arrived you at a certain conclusion. If you don't mind me using an example recently, Yatogami, I think our feelings about, we were talking about Genshin Impact on a previous stream, and Yatogami feels like when you look at the knowledge, there are insights that can be connected into potentially sensible wisdom, that the developers just don't care very much about the specifics of the game. The game is in some way discordant. There are enough elements that it seems like if you would put that in, you would also take care to put this other thing in, but they just didn't do that. And so it's tempting, and I think supported by the evidence, to conclude reasonably that it's basically random why they put those things in. It makes more sense to conclude that there is no underlying reasoning why they put those things in. It was just a bunch of individual insights. Now, personally, I don't agree about the thing we were specifically talking about. I felt like when you look at the information, there's enough of it that seems to be the same motivation. That's I think a pretty obvious motivation lots of games do to, develop things a certain way some amount of the time, but then they just don't care very much. We both agree they don't care enough to follow through with that in other places. And so that explains why there is a relatively reliable trend that characters will get certain abilities that don't really make that much sense in their kit, but it's just for people who enjoy them to enjoy. It's not, random. They're not isolated incidents. It is something the developer is doing systematically, just not very systematically. And I would argue that that is supported by the evidence. You just need to draw a different conclusion from it. It's not as if I'm just arbitrarily inventing a conclusion between those data sets. If you look at the set of information, it does seem like there's a lot of examples of that relative to the number of possible examples. And so it's not unreasonable to conclude that thing. It's also not unreasonable to look at how many places the game has these rough edges that you could quickly clean up and say, I think it's more plausible that there isn't an underlying philosophy behind those bits of information. There's a decent number of them, but whether it's enough of them that you would think there's some reasoning behind their inclusion, or there's not enough of them and you'd conclude that it is like a coincidence, basically, I would argue that those are both pretty objectively sensible claims, given that amount of information. We can't know this, of course. I think the kind of scary thing, I guess, is that the thing dividing that from conspiracy theory is basically just the number of humans that think that that is a sensible way to think things, right? The way you test this would be you have everybody run the experiment or the equation, as I termed it. You write out or explain the reasoning that got you to this point. Give everybody the experiences they need. I guess they all have to play Genshin Impact in this point. And see how many of them arrive at the conclusion. And what I would argue is that because the idea behind the reasonable conclusion doesn't rely on outside biases very heavily, if that's true, you would see that most people would be able to reproduce that understanding. So in other words, if my perspective or Yatogami's perspective on Genshin Impact is indeed a usefully objective perspective and not just something that we're concluding out of thin air, you would see that most people would be able to reproduce it because you don't need any particular experiences beyond understanding the premises to construct that meaning. If it was a conspiracy theory, for example, another thing I've heard that I don't think makes sense at all, is that the developers believe that those are powerful traits or aspects of the game, and they just don't know that they're like really weak. That just doesn't make sense. Like if you see the rest of the game and the way it's constructed, a certain level of understanding of the game mechanics, a certain pretty basic level, not a high level really, that I believe it is preposterous to suggest that the developers don't have that incredibly basic level of understanding about the game mechanics. The game is not perfectly balanced by a long stretch, but it's balanced not atrociously enough and intentionally enough, I think, that it just doesn't make sense to suggest that they don't know that this many aspects of the game are actually like really, really weak. They are either doing that because they don't care whether they're very powerful, or because they know they're not that powerful and they just don't think that's a big deal, or they think there's a good reason for that. It's not because they believe them to be powerful. They either don't care that they are, or they know that they aren't. And I think that's true because I think that if you gave people the kind of a recipe for that viewpoint, most people wouldn't be able to produce that understanding. It just isn't supported by the evidence in some, I believe, ultimately objective, but pretty gray way. You see what I mean? Like it's basically just less people understanding it. But it is less people understanding it because it requires some outside bias or feelings that most people don't have. You have to have them or it doesn't make sense. And so in some way that isn't a set number, is really only less people, but is still in some way objective, or maybe a weird word to use here is pure. It is a more a more unfiltered understanding, reason working correctly, you wouldn't draw that conclusion, whereas you kind of would these other conclusions. That doesn't mean that Yatogami and or I am correct. It just means that there is some meaningful way in which it's more useful to suggest that to other people. It's much more likely that they will go on to have an experience where that point of view will make sense, basically. And they won't be left thinking, why the heck would you think that? Personally, I, for what it's worth, since Yatogami, technically I'm responding to something Yatogami and I talked about, I think it makes sense to think that way as I understood what you were thinking. It seemed to me like you don't think it makes sense for me to think the way I do, but I would like to suggest, by including this a little bit, that the only thing going on there is that I also constructed meaning using the same process you did. It's just possible to conclude something else reasonably. It's not like there's one conclusion you can get out, except when there is. Like sometimes I think there is not one right answer, but in practice you won't think anything but this if you do the process, and so that creates these odd moments where it's like it's not that we're all going to think the exact same thing, but you would notice an incredibly strong trend where reasonable people won't think this, this thing. I feel like that's always been a weird conundrum about reasoning. It can feel like people are not using reasoning when they arrive at a different conclusion than our own, my own. I'm speaking from my own experience. Even though they perhaps are, or perhaps there is no clear way that a certain reasoning is kind of wrong. It's just that it's constructed of ingredients that most people don't have. Again, it's kind of less useful, I guess. We don't know. I mean, to some extent, it's also probably like in reality, Yatogami and I are both probably wrong to some extent. It's probably some like weird specific combination. This example is just an oversimplification, for goodness sakes. Yatogami, thank you for providing that extremely useful example. You at the end said, an addendum, what's your favorite conspiracy theory? What's the distinction between speculation and conspiracy theory? Ooh, that last one is hard. Like you said, Yatogami, I don't have enough experience with conspiracy theories to have a favorite one. I don't know. You could go in a few camps with favorite conspiracy theories. You could do one that is so blatantly ridiculous from our own perception that it immediately points out people who don't care at all about logical thinking. But I don't want to discount people just because they don't care about logical thinking, because I believe that people who arrived at a conspiracy theory are capable of thinking that should give them good conclusions. They just don't. There's some reason they need to skip steps in that process. So when you say what's my favorite conspiracy theory, I guess I don't want to like one of those. Like it might be something like chemtrails. There's a really good Kurzgesagt video about a good way to debunk conspiracy theories that's very different from what we've talked about here. You simply think about if people affected by the conspiracy theory being true are the people that hold power in a society. So for example, chemtrails, this is a conspiracy theory that planes are spraying harmful chemicals all over the people below. Do rich people walk outside? Like, yes. So probably if they have, the people that have any control over the world we live in would be negatively affected by something they would be the ones who have control over it. So why would they do that? That makes no sense. They would be negatively affecting themselves. Now, the reason I don't like that method is because it only works well for people who already don't conspiracy theorize. It's only a very quick and efficient way to check that something is indeed not some kind of grain of truth that's secretly true. It's a way to pretty infallibly guarantee that things people suspect are true or are afraid are true really aren't. You don't have to be worried. You reasonable person, you don't have to be afraid. But it doesn't do anything for people who believe in the conspiracy, because they will explain away something. This is the step where they give the conspiracy theory process a little bit for free because they really want it to be true. It would feel better if they didn't have to update their view of things. It would feel better if some simple bad thing that they could easily get mad at was true. So they will put a lot of effort into making that process of debunking seem invalid. They'll put seemingly ridiculous amounts of effort into that because they have a need for the conspiracy theory to be true, a kind of ingredient in the equation of constructing that truth that you don't have. And that way of debunking conspiracy theories doesn't address those ingredients. I'm not sure there really even is a way to basically having an overall better life, or perhaps therapy, like talking about that need, would really be the only way to get people to give up on these things. They have some need or some desire for the thing to be true that is stronger than their desire for logic. Another kind of third secret way, I guess, to make conspiracy theories go away is the way I've chosen in my own career, is to create a community where reason is so highly valued that it's kind of untenable to give it up. In other words, create a community where the trade-off, where you want something to be true so much that you can give up using your reasoning properly, instead of trying to get people to give up the wanting the conspiracy theory part, make people value reason so much more that they won't give it up to make a conspiracy theory true. I just think that most people in most walks of life, reason is cheap. Like it's not, you don't need to not give up reason because people aren't reasonable. People don't, I'm getting heated up now because I'm passionate about this topic. I believe very strongly that this works well. You can see it in our community. People don't insist on you giving a reason for the thing you think. They just don't really care what the reason is. It's almost seen as being like unfashionable or tacky to explain why you think something. It's like, I don't need your whole life story. Like, shut up. People should need reasons for the things they say. Big deal. Like, get over it. If you want to hear someone's opinion, listen for 5 seconds. As you can see, a little touchy on this subject. So yeah, go figure. It's like when someone asks how your day was and you say, not a novel, but like a few sentences, and they're like, okay, well, I didn't need your whole whatever. Don't ask how I am then. Like, and none of you do this, of course, and that's not a coincidence. I have not experienced many people who strongly believe something that doesn't really hold up to a, kind of basic equation for constructing that meaning, because we're in a community where I focus almost everything that I'm saying and doing on the reasons. You could take or leave my reasons, but it's all based on reasoning. If you don't highly value and cultivate that ability, nothing that I make for entertainment is useful. There isn't anything in it except the reasoning. There is no entertainment value except listening to someone reason through something. So that's why I'm not worried that this seeming tangent is going to be a problem. Now, Yatogami, I made this parlay a little longer than normal because I added my own tangent about you and I having perspectives on the Genshin Impact thing that I think are both reasonable, but there is another not reasonable perspective, and I wanted to demonstrate as an example about conspiracy theories why I think that one is in some objective way not reasonable, but our two perspectives are in some meaningful way reasonable. And how you can you could maybe test that, I guess. It's not just people agreeing, though. People would need to become people who could adapt other people's methods of reasoning, which they're just not. And so I guess that wouldn't work in our current society. I don't know. But anyway, favorite conspiracy theory, I don't really know what to say. I almost want to say something that kind of proves that those people don't use proper reasoning, but I don't think conspiracy theories exactly work like that. So I would be tempted to say just like the stupidest one. I don't know. One I've had fun with is flat Earth theory, the idea that the Earth is flat, which is an example of one that is so preposterous, like so world breaking, like nothing makes any sense if that's true. But again, that's not really relevant to the people that believe it. The reason I like that one is because trying to demonstrate it one way or another is surprisingly not hard, but like it's one of those things where like the way you would show someone that the Earth isn't, it's hard to see that the Earth is round from the Earth. Basically, that's what I'm getting at, right? That's the long and the short of it. There are some conspiracy theories where there's a grain of truth, like planes barfing up a bunch of exhaust above us probably don't have a positive effect on our health. They're just not, it's not a deliberately negative effect, like there's a kind of grain of truth that should be ignored. Like, of course they have a negative effect, humans sacrifice lots of health stuff in the price of progress, But this is a different kind of conspiracy theory where there's no need to prove that it's not true. But if you were to try, it's like oddly involved in some way, because of what would constitute kind of proof. The Earth does feel flat, I guess, like from the surface of the Earth, until you think about, like, humans are just bad at experiencing big numbers. So, like, yeah, it looks flat, but it totally is round. It's just that if you zoom in on a circle a lot, it looks flat. That's not complicated. But you see what I'm trying to say? I don't know. I've always kind of liked that one. It's just so preposterous, and yet it's kind of understandable why people are confused. I don't know. But it comes from a suspicion of scientists, which is my least favorite thing. Anyway, what's the distinction between speculation and conspiracy theory? Yeah, man, it's a lot. I guess speculation is more defined as imagining what the equation would be to construct meaning if you had knowledge, insight, wisdom that you don't. Maybe you'd say that way. So an example of speculation would be, I think that various games I play would be more enjoyable to people if they changed this, that, and the other thing. And I think that that is a replicable equation, in some way kind of objectively correct, only to the extent that I'm constructing that prediction out of the way equations tend to work out to be true. In other words, I've got examples of knowledge, insight, wisdom where the game seems to be received well and do well because it's cohesive. And so it seems like if you look at the information for why people bounce off of a game, a lot of the negative things come back to the game not being cohesively developed under a certain ideology. So if it was, it seems like usually when that's the case in another equation, that equation works out. And so it's reasonable to assume it's true here, basically. Performing the process of most people buying into a certain mindset, if you give them the equation to reproduce it, for equations with which to reproduce mindsets, going kind of a level up. I guess that's what speculation is, whereas conspiracy theory isn't using that process as a way to verify the potential validity of a point. It will just use any given information point. I'm increasingly agreeing with your idea that conspiracy theories are like you mostly stop at the information phase, actually. Earlier, I kind of bounced off of that. This parlay is ending up really long because I have a lot to say. And originally I felt like, no, they are using this process, but to the outside, yeah, it feels like they're stopping at the information stage and the connections they're making seem unwarranted. The system by which you normally make useful connections doesn't produce the connections they make, basically. Again, the equation doesn't really line up. So yeah, I get that a lot better now that I've thought through it. Cool. Okay, that's a useful way to think of it. I kind of like your way better. Okay, a big parlay, but I also wanted to follow up on that thing we were talking on a stream, and this was a long parlay, and you waited a while too because I was on break between this batch. So I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. Again, I kind of thought this one was going to be easy. Maybe I shouldn't tell you that, but I was looking forward to this one because I thought it'd be easy, and it really wasn't. I had fun doing it, but yeah, it was definitely a mental exercise.